Good, look at the time. Oh, it's midday here. So good afternoon. Later than I typically do these recordings, having just finished riding the 2019 UCI World Harrogate Circuit virtually on Swift on my turbo trainer. I was a hilly route, but not as hilly as some. It's so cold because I've got my trainer set out on the patio, and usually sweat quite a lot doing these sessions. I've actually still got my cycling jacket on just to, it was kept on all through the ride. It was so chilly out there. I think we've got a hot weather forecast at the end of the week. Anyway, yesterday, my last video was on a particular aspect of language. And it's interesting because these patterns in language are part of what's technically known as the meta model. A chapter in my book is called Precision Questions, because it's about how to question these patterns when we recognize them in ourselves and then maybe in other people. And there's a whole world in each one. There's really no end to our ability to study the impact of these patterns and many other things. Sometimes it's interesting when I've asked people to tell me why they perhaps wish to enroll in one of my trainings. And I've had a couple of people over time, I think a lot of people kind of know my style now. I've had a couple of people over time say, well, I want it to be packed, I want to be going at a pretty good pace and lots of content. And that's really not what it's about. The real learning comes from kind of slowing down and being aware of what we're doing, what we're saying, what we're thinking, so that we become, if we choose to, purposeful in the way that we speak, in the way that we think. I did an online session on Feldenkrais. I'll put that name in the notes about this session, named after a man called Moishe Feldenkrais. And I did it online live with Ed Woodall this morning. He does these fantastic short sessions every morning and every evening. And it's a great way to be introduced to Feldenkrais, which I have often thought of as, I'll probably get told off by Feldenkrais purists for this, as an awareness of movement. It's like an LP for the body. They absolutely complement each other. It's just that Feldenkrais has got more emphasis, if you like. It studies the physical nature of how we can be our best self, the self we were born to be. And it's very much about, it's not about stretching and pushing, and yet we can achieve remarkable things, remarkable changes, kind of magical changes, by learning to pay attention to ourselves. I've always thought it's a way of modeling the best parts of ourselves so that our whole body reorganizes. Anyway, just pause on that for the moment. But I was reflecting on NLP as I was listening to Ed, who was, we studied together for a long time, about 4 or 5 years, and he's got a lovely style. I recommend that you tune into them. What's it called? Something in isolation, Feldenkrais in isolation. It's more than that. So my question to start, the link that I'm going to make, is there something, is there anything in your experience right now that you find challenging, or that you feel that you are a bit stuck with, or what would be another way of phrasing it, something that is not the way you'd wish it to be? Are you not the way, let me put it like this, are you not the way that you would wish to be in some aspects? And I was doing a coaching session, and very often coaching sessions that I do online, often people come to me or ask me to coach them because they have an issue of some kind. Not always. Some people come because they want to learn NLP and they want to do it one-on-one, so they want to develop themselves. It's not necessarily coming from a problem space. But I suppose by and large, there's probably tips in the direction of people who are not being as they would wish. And it was interesting listening to somebody I was coaching recently. And I noticed certain patterns in the way that they were speaking. And things like, so for example, they were saying, well, that's when the anxiety comes and it makes me feel da, da, da. And it's the feeling that I have about that is the issue. And other examples of what they were saying. And the consequence was that they felt low. It was a feeling of low, of kind of being lost to themselves. And I noticed a pattern. Now, those of you that have studied language patterns, either with me or anywhere else, might already have detected what's a pattern in those things. They weren't all bunched together like that. What's the pattern? Now, you might have noticed, for example, that there was a cause effect. So they were saying, this makes me. And these, the patterns that I'm going to, the two particular patterns that I'm going to talk about do often go together. So when someone says, this makes me, they've kind of said they've let go of control of themselves. Something else is controlling them. They're letting something else control them because this makes me. I think I said in an earlier video, one of the worst coaching questions, and yeah, I've had people seemingly have been taught to ask it, is to ask people, how does that make you feel? I mean, because you're compounding the fact that something can make you feel something, when really the ideal is to explore how you can manage and choose the way you are. So to ask somebody how something makes you feel, and they might not feel it initially, they might be seeing it or hearing it. Anyway, so I would say that's a question to avoid. So you may have noticed the cause effect. This makes me feel this. And there was another pattern that was repeated. And the pattern, the technical term for it, is a nominalization. A nominalization means that you've given a name to something that would otherwise, and made it a thing, made it an abstract thing that would otherwise be an activity. So, for example, if you talk about the feeling or the anxiety, and it's often preceded by the or you've given something an identity that it actually doesn't have. It's interesting when you think about the virus, same thing. Instead of saying we are catching or we're transmitting, something, well, even the something is a nominalization. So we've given this thing an identity. And that's a way of letting things or creating the way of thinking about things in such a way that you give them control. You let them control you rather than you controlling or managing them. So when a nominalization, like the anxiety, the feeling, the situation, when that's a habit, when somebody's using that regularly, consistently, let's say in every few sentences, then it's worth highlighting that. if you have that permission, if you're in that role. This is not something to do when somebody hasn't asked you to do it. It can be a great rapport breaker if you do that. Do it to yourself. That's the starting point. Sometimes it's the end point as well. It's like, do this to yourself. Like, find out what are the patterns, what habits. And that was what yesterday's video was about. What habits, what addictions have you got in your language? And to have a pattern of using these abstract nouns to give things an identity that don't actually have an identity as such, is also to create a stuck state. So a nominalization is like the communication, the worry, the situation. It's kind of boom, sort of creates a fixed stuck state. It's also used in hypnotic language. So it's a way of creating a trance, which can be useful many times. When these things are done without awareness and without intention, without conscious intention and purpose, then they're not so useful typically. So I pointed this out. I checked, I asked first of all if this person was aware of the pattern. And typically people are not aware of patterns, of things that they repeat in their language. They might be aware of what they repeat in the content, but not in the structure. And so the structure of his experience was that he would take something, make it into a nominalization, into a thing, the worry, the anxiety, then use a cause effect. So that makes me, which it can do when we use that pattern, that makes me, and then that triggered a feeling, usually a feeling of loss, a feeling of anxiety. That's a structure. When we say we're studying the structure of subjective experience, which is the definition of NLP, that's a structure. There's more to it than that. There are beliefs behind it as to where this has come from. So the belief of being, in this case, not valued, which came from early experiences. It didn't come from the experiences. It came from the way that this person had framed, had represented those experiences. That's a choice that we have, is how we hold our memories. So there was a belief that underpinned this behavior, which was to make something that was active into a fixed thing, which then made them, in their interpretation, feel something, and then it led to a feeling. So that's structure. That's what we study. That's what I study with NLP, because that's where the learning lies. That's where we can unlock our potential. That's where we can unlock limiting patterns. That's where we can substitute limiting patterns with enabling patterns. And what was interesting was what happened next. Having pointed out the pattern, and this often happens if somebody's engaged with what you're telling them in this case, is that they will look for a way to change the pattern. And invariably at first they'll replace the pattern with another form of the same pattern. So for example, if I point out to somebody that they're saying but, they might then come back and say, well, however, or nevertheless. And so, but it's still a but. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing, basically. So it's still the same structure. It's still got that dismissal of what's gone before. It's just disguised in kind of fancier language. And this happened too. So they sought other ways of expressing and came back with more examples of the same pattern, but in different in just different language, different form. And they couldn't think at that moment of a way of replacing it. Now that was interesting too, as to what happened then. And this is what, for me, this is what coaching is all about. I mean, you can coach at a very high level, very big chunk things, and this is kind of very specific, typically language-centered coaching. And I waited, and I was curious that they continued to search without success in that moment. What I was interested in was that they didn't ask me for an example. So when you point out a behavior, when you highlight with feedback, and as you create space, which can often be silence, so you're holding space, both to notice what the person does with that space, because that's a pattern too. So, and you go, so this is how this person creates some of their experience, by using these language patterns and by being self-reliant, internally referenced, which can be a great value. But if it's used as a habit, when you could be asking somebody else for help, then it gets in the way. And so I was intrigued that that was, and so I then pointed out that pattern. And usually when you point out patterns like that, it can lead to an aha moment for people, for yourself first of all. But with these kinds of things, this is why it's useful to work with somebody else, because you can be oblivious, blind to the patterns that you use, whereas somebody else may be better able to highlight them for you. Yeah. However, having had quite a bit of feedback about the previous videos that I've done and discussions in some of the course member WhatsApp groups I'm a member of, I noticed people very quick to pick up patterns in their ways of speaking and in my way of speaking as well. So it kind of comes back and bites me on the bum in a very nice way, of course. So it's interesting how we are thinking about what we are experiencing in the world today. And how can we be thinking and speaking about what we are experiencing? And you notice I'm using a lot of words that end in ing. They are usually active words, active verbs. It's one of the ways in which you can shift from using abstract nouns that might lead to you getting yourself stuck, to finding a way of moving. And just like Feldenkrais is it's like keep moving. So Moischi Feldenkrais said moving is the key. It's when we are static. And the same when I'm in India, the Swami, my very good friend, the Swami G, incredible coach, doctor, advisor, he says lots of wise things. One thing he says is that the chair is the downfall of Western society. Interestingly, the Feldenkrais session that we did this morning, and you can still access it online, by the way, was sitting in a chair to do it, whereas much of the Feldenkrais is done by laying on the floor. And he says that the chair, because we get so static when we're sitting in a chair, typically, he said that's the downfall of Western society. One of them, he's got quite a list actually. So what might be something that you have coded in a way that's given something control over you, that's led to you being stuck in some way? And how might you change the way that you are speaking about that, thinking about that, in such a way that you are moving? And I noticed just now that my neighbour and his wife and their children, they go for a walk every day. And sometimes moving as you're moving physically, as you're moving mentally, can be the way to unlock certain states. So there we are. Every single pattern in language has got a depth to it. So those people say, well, let's just, oh, I've done that. I've done language patterns. Yeah, right. I don't think we've ever done language patterns or anything else for that matter.